Okay, so welcome everybody. For those of you that are joining us from further afield than LearnSci, welcome. This is our third webinar today, and we're really delighted to introduce Kirsty and her fantastic work that she's been doing in the realms of how we can get people more understanding of the ethics around the ethics around using AI. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Leanne Williams. I'm a professor of bioscience education at the University of Warwick, where I still teach, but I'm also the academic lead for LearnSci. I'm not going to talk much about LearnSci. For those of you that don't necessarily know, we generate digital resources to support STEM learning with a focus on technical and analytical skills acquisition and supporting educators in hopefully helping to reduce some workload and so on as well. A part of our role is to showcase good practice and to, develop our community of educators. And so we're really excited to host a Teaching Innovation Award program, and we do this every year. We have external judges who will judge our applicants, and they're then awarded on some of the criteria that we select. And some of that criteria ensures that we are not just showcasing people who are utilizing our resources and our digital tools, but anybody who uses any innovation in the digital sphere, essentially to support student learning and academics in their teaching. And so, of course, I was really excited when Kirsty sent in her application, because this is not your typical AI project. This is something that goes far beyond what most institutions are doing. And I guarantee that you will find some of this really interesting and you will learn a lot from this. I was really fortunate to work with Kirsty at the beginning of this project to talk a bit about my thoughts on how AI can possibly help students with different learning difficulties, with certain mental health priorities, as well as physical disabilities, to potentially level the playing field. So I'm really delighted to support Kirsty and showcase her work today. For those of you that are interested in the TI Awards, please visit our website and have a look to see what you think you can contribute. But not just that, visit the website to get some inspiration from some of our past winners and the applications within them. Have a look. Honestly, it will give you some inspiration, and I always find it really exciting to judge these. One of the best times of the year for us, because we get to see sort of that cutting edge innovation and thought leaders, really bringing to us new ways of thinking about how we can support students and educators in the higher education sphere. Secondly, if you're interested in how this can relate to education research, again, go to our website and have a look, see how we can maybe support you with that as well. So without any further ado, I'm not going to go into any more introductions to you, Kirsty, so please feel free to introduce yourself and introduce the history of this project. And so we'll give you a good half an hour or so to talk, maybe more, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. I'm sure there will be plenty. I know I will have lots to follow up on what you've been doing. And then hopefully we'll draw the close at around about 1 o'clock, maybe a bit earlier if that happens. And so just a bit of housekeeping then for folks. Please keep your microphones on mute. But if you do want to ask any questions, please raise your hand. Ask in the chat if you don't want to talk out loud. Just a reminder, we'll be recording this, and so if you're happy to have your beautiful faces on the recording, please have your videos on. If you'd rather not, then have your videos off, but utilize the chat function if you wish. Okay, thank you, Kirsty. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Leanne, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's a real pleasure for me to speak at this in this webinar, and also to speak in an initiative that LearnSci have created. I've worked with LearnSci for several years, and that working relationship has always been one which has been innovative and creative, and which I've really enjoyed. So I'm particularly delighted to be here today. And today we're going to talk about a student-led development of a project around the creation of a MOOC. So that is a massive open online course around AI ethics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the project started, what was the incentive to begin a project like this, how the project developed and where we are so far. But I suppose before we start talking about the project, I should introduce myself. So I'm Ciorsdaidh Watts. I'm a senior lecturer in chemistry at the University of Glasgow, where I'm also AI champion and equality, diversity and inclusion lead for chemistry. So this project was a collaboration between myself and the College of Science and Engineering EDI officer, so that's Lydia Bach, and 4 student interns. And I'm going to introduce the student interns in more detail in a later slide because they really are central to this project. So first of all, what is the need for something like a MOOC on AI ethics? I'm going to start off with what literature tells us, and you'll see that from a Glasgow perspective, we mirror kind of national viewpoints on this. So the data that I'm going to show here comes from 2 reports which surveyed over 1,000 students each, one focusing on higher education students in the UK and one focusing on final year high school students in the US. So in 2024, around 50% of higher education UK students said or reported that they use Gen AI for assessments. So I would assume that the level is likely to be higher than this because it was self-reporting. And indeed, I would assume that the level will be higher now than in 2024. About a third of students in higher education aren't able to identify when AI produces falsehoods or hallucinations. I would prefer to call these bullshits, and you'll see later on that there is a reason for me to use that term. There's growing evidence for a digital divide, which AI may be exacerbating, and this could relate to socioeconomic background, gender, or race. Around 3/4 of US final year students reported that they had considerable concerns about the ethical implications of the use of AI. And only about 20% of higher education students felt happy with the level of support around AI that they received from their institutions. So alongside these data, we also have data from Glasgow students. So this initial kind of survey that we conducted had a really limited sample size. You can see it's around 29 students. We've since conducted this with chemistry undergraduate students in Glasgow, and that's around 120 students, but the data for that cohort isn't shown here. So you can see that the reports from Glasgow mirror national findings. So students reported that they were skeptical, wary, insecure. There was a lot of fear and concern around the use of AI in higher education. Also, others reporting that they were interested. There was potential for it to be incredibly useful. They were optimistic, but there were also concerns about overhype, usability, and its impact on learning. And so for Glasgow students, you can see similarly, only around 40% were confident using AI. Around 3/4 were concerned about data privacy. Around 70% concerned about the environmental implications of AI. And only around 20% were optimistic about the ability of AI to tackle global challenges. So fairly pessimistic views around the use of AI, particularly concerns around the environmental implications and also data privacy. So along with the delivery of the Lovelace Hodgkin Symposium on AI ethics, which Leanne mentioned in her introduction, at the same time we were developing this project to produce a MOOC on AI ethics. And we were really fortunate to receive financial support for that project from Learning Teaching Development Fund and also from the Learning Innovation Support Unit for generative AI upskilling at the University of Glasgow. So we worked closely with the Student Opportunities Hub at the university to employ 4 AI ethics intern students. And from the 2 grants, we were able to employ those students across 8 months. And those students were Ava Scott Nadal, who was a final year philosophy student, Annie Sasson, who at the time was a postgraduate student in children's literature, Nick Smoliak, who was and still is a PhD student in chemical engineering, and Abby Thorpe, who was at the time a final year law student and has now gone on to pursue a master's in Glasgow on technology law, partly inspired by this project. So the students themselves, the student interns, reported the importance of the student voice in creation of curriculum around AI, particularly AI ethics frameworks. They said that they believed that their input helped to reduce expert blindness. In other words, if you are faculty at a university, it's likely to be more difficult for you to relate to the student experience as it is currently in the climate of rapid AI development. And so student input helps to reduce that expert blindness. They felt that their input also gave a really useful initial feedback loop. So they could test curriculum, report back findings, give feedback, and that helps to improve the learning experience for students and educators. And in an area as rapidly evolving as AI, and particularly AI ethics, students felt that broad perspectives were really important to involve diverse experiences and viewpoints. And also, because AI and AI ethics impact students immediately today in their studies and in their life, they felt that their voice was really important. But why is the topic of AI ethics important in the first place? I think that this graphic by Hendricks in 2024 is incredibly useful in helping us to visualize the impact of bias in AI systems and how it can lead to harms. But where do those biases come from in the first place? I've heard AI and AI technologies described as mirrors which help to reflect the biases of our own society. And I think that's a really useful image to have, because we know that we all hold psychological bias. And we know that there's historical bias in the data that is used to train AI systems. For example, often female data is left out of medical inquiry. And we know that there's societal bias. So who holds the power in the creation and training of AI systems? We know that often data science and data scientists, it's a kind of homogenous group of people, often with minoritized groups lacking in that viewpoint. So that leads to bias in data collection and algorithmic bias, which leads to bias in the system, which can then amplify those original biases. And it's a kind of cyclic loop of increased bias and therefore harms. So when we're thinking about AI and AI ethics, particularly in this project and in the MOOC, we wanted to consider AI ethics beyond the other AI, so beyond just academic integrity, which of course is important, but the discussion often revolves around academic integrity when we think about AI in higher education. But there are so many other ethical questions around AI that we wanted to consider. One being, for example, the environmental impacts of the use of AI, not just energy use, but the consumption of fresh water. We actually worked with students at GEST, that's Glasgow University Environmental Sustainability Team, to produce an information campaign, digital information campaign at the University of Glasgow as part of this MOOC development project. And you can read more about that in the publication if you're interested. There are lots of examples also where AI and emerging technologies can be used in a positive way when we think about the environment. So a good example of a project which is trying to use emerging technologies in a positive way when we think about the environment is the Solar Protocol. And this is described in the Good Robot podcast episode, Surfing the Web in Sync with the Sun. So this project uses servers for a particular web page, and the server that you're going to be directed to when you access that web page will depend on which server is receiving most sunlight at that time of the day. And it means that there are interruptions in your delivery of of the information. Some periods of the day will be slower, but that's kind of the point. The purpose of this is to help us to think about the physical systems and the physical themes that we are experiencing when we use and consume AI and other technologies. So in other words, to link our digital consumption with seasons and times and physical times, to link web with our physical environment. Another thing that we wanted to think about when we produced the MOOC was how minoritized groups can be represented or misrepresented with emerging technologies. And a really good example of work around this area is work by Dr. Joy Buolamwini, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. If you're not familiar with Dr. Joy's work, I would really recommend investigating that work. It's a really potent and poignant illustration of some of the biases and misrepresentations which can occur with facial recognition algorithms. And of course, facial recognition algorithms are involved in things like law enforcement and medical care provision. So really important experiences in our everyday. And Dr. Joy's work highlights the fact that women of color using facial recognition algorithms in Google, Deep Blue, Windows, Amazon are often misidentified as male or simply failed in the identification. We also wanted to think about data privacy, one of the subjects that our students were most concerned about, and inequity of access. So we know that large language models are Anglocentric in their nature, not only in the data that they use to train large language models, but also in the cultural references which are inherent in those, which excludes, vast portions of the world. We also wanted to think about missing data, so the exclusion of particular groups from the data sets which are used to train AI models, and therefore a lack of representation. And in the MOOC, we consider governance, we consider the European, American, and Chinese laws around the use of AI and lack of inclusion in some aspects. We also want to think about AI in healthcare and the particularly sensitive data which is used in the context of healthcare. There's been increasing evidence and discussion around AI as mental health companions, particularly for students in higher education. But there are, of course, concerns around this, concerns around sensitive data and judgment of AI chatbots. But there are lots of examples as well of where AI can be incredibly helpful and useful in healthcare. For example, triaging imagery around, for example, cancer diagnostics. There are lots of examples actually at Glasgow University where AI technologies are being used in really innovative ways around healthcare. So in the MOOC, we're not only discussing the challenges of AI bias, but we also discuss the opportunities and innovations around the use of AI in areas such as healthcare and the environment. We also want to think about the narratives around AI, and with narratives also comes the question of power. Who holds the power? Because the way we speak and speak about and see AI really impacts our awareness and our understanding of AI. So in the media, there tends to be a kind of polarization of the narrative. On one side, you have kind of doomsday narrative espoused by people like Elon Musk, but you only have to look at the kind of ideological meanderings of the CEO of Palantir to really have that seared into your mind. But then there's the opposite, where you have a kind of utopia description of the use of AI and how it will solve all the problems of the world. And really what we're advocating for in the MOOC is a more nuanced description of AI and its impacts in our lives and in the realms of education. And I think the imagery and the words we use when we consider AI, these are really, really important to how we imagine AI and how we imagine our relationship to AI, our consumption of AI, and also conversely, the consumption of AI of our data. You know, there is a tendency to anthropomorphize AI, to give it intention. And equally, there's maybe a tendency to discuss AI technologies as neutral technologies, but of course they're not neutral because they exist in context, and the data that builds AI technologies, these data are not neutral. So I think it's really important that we demystify AI. So I think it would be great if we could reduce the use of terms like algorithms, because they tend to mean nothing to most people, and also change the images we use around AI. So we tend to use these kind of tropes of the, you know, the digital finger meeting the human finger or the robot. And I think these again mystify AI and tend to make it the other. So there's a great website, which is the Better Images of AI website, where you can find freely available images from real artists around AI and its impact on society. So I recommend go and have a look and use some of those resources if you can. So what was the purpose of the MOOC on AI ethics? We wanted to support our university community and more broadly to have the skills and vocabulary to really challenge AI progress, I suppose, to critically evaluate the AI technologies that we use, to be able to see the challenges, but also the opportunities available with AI technologies. And we wanted this MOOC to be responsive to this really dynamic environment of AI and also to the lived experiences of students and staff. And it was really important to us that this was a co-creation with students at the heart of the project, because we know that our students are the first generation to experience the impact of AI in their higher education. We didn't in the same way. So they're really at the forefront of this landscape. So the MOOC was informed partly by the symposium, which all of our student interns were central to. Literature review, peer perspectives, and the students' own experiences. It was launched on FutureLearn in May of last year. And last year and into this year, it was also incorporated into chemistry curriculum. So year 2, that's around 200 chemistry students in Glasgow. It was part of the interactive teaching unit. And also in a final year engineering course, it formed the AI ethics module as part of the AI and robotics course. So the MOOC is freely available on FutureLearn. If you're interested, you can scan the QR code to access the MOOC. It's freely available at source over 3 weeks for those out with the University of Glasgow. For staff and students in Glasgow, it's available without time limit. If you're outside the University of Glasgow, it's a 3-week course, after which you would have to pay for unlimited access. So a little bit of the course overview. The course runs over 3 weeks, but completely asynchronous to any subjects or campus-based learning. It's completely online and self-directed, and the 3 weeks are broken up into an introduction to AI, an introduction to ethics, and the student experience. Week 2 is existential and governance. So thinking about AI narratives, media impact on our understanding of AI, and then governance across Europe, America, and China. And then the final week is an example of real world implications of AI, thinking about environmental impact and healthcare. And each of these weeks is kind of interspersed with hopefully really engaging material, a mixture of videos, interviews, and also tasks, interspersed with tasks for each of the learners to interact with and engage with. And the learners are really encouraged to post discussion points. And what's been really pleasing about the MOOC is that these discussion points have been really actively engaged with. And so students are learning from one another, and we're learning from students, which is a really fantastic outcome. So the MOOC so far, it was launched in May of last year, and so far over 1,500 learners have engaged with the MOOC. Around 35,000 learning steps have been completed, but this is the part that I'm really pleased about. More than 2,500 discussion posts have been placed on the MOOC. So students are really engaging with discussions, engaging with one another, and learning from one another. Feedback from our learners has been broadly really positive. 95% of students felt that the MOOC met or exceeded their expectations, and around 90% of students gained new knowledge and skills from the MOOC. So here are some quotes: academically rigorous, thoughtful examples and activities to encourage ethical learning. There was a lot to pursue, and they really enjoyed the course. They gained new knowledge, particularly on the environmental impacts of AI. I would say that our feedback is broadly really positive, and that's really pleasing to see. One of the things that we definitely will take away from the development of this MOOC is that 3 weeks is probably not long enough for the amount of material that we have in the MOOC. And I'll actually talk in a little while about how we're redeveloping the MOOC. But some students felt like the course content was a little bit too packed, and they couldn't complete the MOOC in 3 weeks on top of their own courses and whatever they were doing, or if they were in employment. And so that's something that we really need to reflect on. Of course, this is an ongoing project, and it's stimulated more discussion on the impact of AI in STEM education, higher education more broadly. If you're interested in a discussion that I had on this topic, you might be interested in the podcast AI Right, which is a Scottish-based podcast on all things AI. And in this particular episode, thinking about the future of AI in education and AI ethics. And we've also published a paper in the Journal for Learning Development and Higher Education on the evolving frameworks for responsible and human-centered AI practice in higher education. And in that, we really advocate for the cultivation of innovative but compassionate and connected AI technologies. And we say that we think that there's an urgent imperative to shape these tools for the common good. So future work and ongoing work. I'm really delighted to say that we've been able to employ 2 of our student interns again, due to EPSRC funding for this project that we received this year for AI underpinning at the University of Glasgow. So we've been able to re-employ Abby and Nick to respond to that feedback around the kind of packed nature of the MOOC, to update, because of course this is a really rapidly evolving landscape and we want to keep it as current as possible, and also to expand the MOOC. We're thinking about how we might expand the MOOC into different formats, to, for example, make it easier to incorporate into a curriculum-based course at the University of Glasgow. So ways in which we can condense the MOOC to more bite-sized information that's still relevant. And so we're going to relaunch the MOOC on Future Learn in 2026, but it continues until then. And I mentioned that we've been running a project with the Year 2 chemistry students that have had access to the MOOC, and we're kind of analysing the impact of the MOOC on their perspectives on AI ethics. And that's a collaboration with Dr. Frances Doherty at University of Glasgow Chemistry. I'm really interested and excited to see the outcome of that project. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening to my kind of thoughts and perspectives and to the project. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And you can email me or you can contact me on LinkedIn. But that is it for just now. Thank you so much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kirsty. That was fantastic. Before I ask some questions, before I open the floor to questions, so this is going to give everyone time to think of a question to ask Kirsty, unless you've already got them. Would it be possible for you to just give a bit of an overview of the sectors that you worked with on this project? So the thing that really struck me in the symposium that both Bill and I were fortunate to come to, it really struck me how very different this AI project was to any other project that I had been involved in or had known about, was the sectors that had come together from that symposium to work together. It wasn't just UK institutions, it wasn't just academics, it was much wider than that. Would you be able to give a little bit of an overview of that, just to get people to understand the real value and the authenticity of the content that you've put together in this project?
Yeah, thanks so much, Leanne. That's a great question, and it's something I didn't really have time, or I didn't focus on in the webinar itself. So what I didn't kind of have the chance to say was that I kind of hinted at it, that the MOOC was partly informed by the symposium. So we've had 2 symposia, we'll have a 3rd one this year. But in the first year of the symposium, we focused on societal impacts of AI, including but beyond higher education. And so we thought it was really important not only to hear from academics and those in industry, but also to kind of hear from lived experiences of minoritized groups who may be disproportionately impacted by some of these questions of AI ethics. So we worked closely with the Alan Turing Institute, which you might know is aligned with universities across the UK and beyond, but it's kind of independent of those. And they produce some great resources on AI technologies, but also on AI ethics. The Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence as well, which is based in Cambridge, but also, for example, with people from industry, such as AI technologists working with Barclays, so in the banking sector, finance sector. Also, though, with the Children's Parliament in Scotland, and with the Scottish AI Alliance, which is a kind of independent group working with the government, but independent of the government, to promote equity in AI technologies and equity and access to AI technologies. We also worked with representatives of race equality, European race equality, and also disability organisations to represent various groups which may be impacted by AI technologies. And so it was a really diverse discussion, and it helped, for me at least, to highlight how broad and varied the impact of AI can be, and also just that AI often impacts areas of our lives which are or can be invisible, and it's really important to try to make the invisible visible. And I think that really helps when we think about AI, not only for our students, but for ourselves, to go beyond academic integrity, although that's of course important, and to be able to visualize some of these invisible implications of AI. I hope that helps.
Yeah, brilliant. That's fantastic. Thank you, Kirsty. And again, I just wanted to really impress on people how this is not just, a standard AI project run by an HE institution, which can sometimes look a bit inwards too much. This really is the scope of the collaborators, and the sources that you've used is incredible. Okay, so a couple of questions. I've got one on the chat by Matt. He says, thank you, great talk. And he's keen to have a look at the course himself. So he said, what have you found are the opinions and critical feedback of students that complete the course that are, one, generally favourable to HE and beyond, and those that are really against the use of AI in HE. So favourable to AI and those that are typically against it. So do you find that greater exposure to the ethical considerations has any impact on both of those groups?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I think the feedback from, so there's kind of two cohorts, I suppose. One is the cohort of chemistry students that we've looked at in detail, chemistry students in Glasgow, and then the broader cohort is all the learners that have taken, have engaged with the MOOC. So I'll, if you don't mind, focus on the broader engagement with the MOOC because I've analysed that data. So for those that are favourable coming into the MOOC, the use of AI in higher education, I think the feedback has been that many of the issues that are raised in the MOOC were unexpected for them. And I think that the MOOC, the feedback has been that the MOOC has helped them to think about particularly environmental impacts of AI, but also implications beyond the kind of pigeonhole of higher education and the impact of AI in higher education. So it's helped them to view the importance of these ethical considerations beyond higher education and in their daily lives. I would say that we have had some feedback from students that are ideologically opposed to the use of AI in higher education, that they felt that the initial week in which we really try and get students to engage with AI technologies to understand some of the kind of black box workings of AI, they found that challenging because they felt that an AI ethics MOOC, where they're asked to initially engage with some of these technologies, was difficult for them to feel that it was justified. So I think that there were definitely some comments that for those that are really ideologically opposed to the use of AI broadly, they disliked that aspect of the MOOC initially. But the purpose of that first week and particularly the introduction to AI was to help students and learners think about some of those inner workings of large language models and, for example, the Anglo-centric nature of AI models. The question of when we talk about AI hallucinations, can we really describe those as hallucinations? Or does that, impart some kind of intention on the large language models themselves? And also to think about how, or I don't really like the term, but how prompt engineering can impact the responses that you get, and what does that mean about the large language model itself? So we thought it was really important to have an actual engagement with AI models in that first week, but I think that there were some questions from those that were ideologically opposed. And I would say that our findings are that where there's a genuine knowledge gap, the MOOC has really helped with that. For example, genuine knowledge gaps on, for example, the freshwater usage of AI. The MOOC shows real implications and kind of positive in terms of information sharing on that. And where there are views that are held, sometimes those are strengthened by the MOOC. But I would say where there are deeply held ideological perspectives, the MOOC doesn't change those. And I'd say that that's what we found. And actually, without analysing the chemistry data in full, that's also what we find from our chemistry cohort.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. That's great. Thank you, Matt, for a great question and a really thorough explanation with that, Kirsty. Has anybody else got any questions they would like to ask Kirsty? John, thank you.
Hi, Kirsty. Nice to see you.
Hi.
I suppose it follows on a little bit from what Matt's saying there, but I'm just interested in what students think about AI in the future and how they are going to have to interact with that in the real world beyond their studies, and and what fear they have around jobs and those sorts of things, and whether that's colouring their thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so we conducted pre-engagement with MOOC survey. We asked the same questions after students had completed the MOOC, and what we found was that students were really concerned about, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. They were, one, concerned about data privacy and the use of AI in higher education particularly, and they were concerned about having to use AI in higher education going forward. But at the same time, they were concerned about levels of support around the use of AI, and if they're not using AI, will they be disadvantaged in the kind of jobs market when they leave university? And there was also concern about, you know, our AI technology is going to take our jobs. So one of the courses that we incorporated the MOOC into is a engineering, AI and robotics course. And so those students are, you know, in the area of kind of engineering, data science, and there was concern there, like, you know, what about our jobs? But this is something that we tackle directly in the MOOC, or at least we encounter directly in the MOOC. We think about, you know, perspectives, like thinking about Geoffrey Hinton and what he said about AI and its impact on employment going forward, but also to kind of try to debunk some of the myths. And we talk to, for example, someone that works in AI technology and computer science with Barclays, and really the importance of the human in the loop, and that there are certain aspects of human engagement that cannot be recreated, you know, introspection, reflection, you know, empathy, and that all these things remain important. And we use lots of examples to try to reduce the hype around AI, and to encourage students to be able to critically analyze the outputs of AI, and therefore to also, as well as, you know, identifying the real opportunities that AI offers, to also identify, you know, that there are problems with the use of AI. There are problems with wholesale taking on of AI, and the short-sighted nature of companies that are, you know, making many people redundant in favor of AI technologies. That's likely to be a short-sighted perspective, and perhaps not productive in the end. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, John. Okay, Roy, you've got your hand up.
Hi, yeah. Not so much a question, more I'd like your comments on an observation. A colleague who teaches on an environmental science degree, and the subject of AI came up, and about 3/4 of the cohort were heavily against AI because of its environmental impact. Okay, not so much loss of jobs, etc. It was to do with the environmental impact. When the coursework came in, it was very obvious that about 3/4 of them had used AI very well. In some cases, it was very obvious that they'd used more than one AI engine. They put the initial prompts into one, taken the output from that, put it into another one to make sure it was beautifully presented, etc. I'm just wondering about, with your knowledge now around this subject, what sort of observations you might have on that, and what I've heard called the tyranny of small decisions. Lots of people thinking, oh, I'm only one, but actually all of them together making a huge difference.
Yeah, thank you. That's an amazing, very important observation, and really interesting. And I think, just anecdotally, in my own household, you know, people that are very environmentally aware, perhaps not acknowledging as you say, the small decisions that we make ourselves around the use of AI. You know, you can be very environmentally aware and at the same time then choose to use AI technologies. I think what we would in the MOOC advocate for is a conscious consumption of AI. And I mentioned the solar protocol. I didn't really describe it very eloquently, but what I was trying to say was that what it advocates for and what we would probably advocate for is not necessarily an entire reduction in the use of AI, because I think that's an unachievable goal, but more a conscious consumption or a syncing of your consumption with something like, you know, the movement of the sun, or the movement of us around the sun. So that's partly what our environmental information campaign was around, just highlighting. So we highlighted individual use of AI. So, you know, for example, if you ask one prompt using ChatGPT, that's the equivalent of the consumption of a bottle, 500 mils of fresh water. So the purpose of that was that's also a simplified description of the use of fresh water, but it is based in actual data. And the purpose was to highlight that as individuals, we have choice, and our choices matter. And then we also had a building-wide information poster, which highlighted, okay, so individually we can make these decisions, but then imagine if everyone in this building made that same decision to use a prompt for ChatGPT prompt, what would be the freshwater implications? So trying to highlight the fact that small decisions add up, and we have agency as individuals, and trying to activate that agency is really important. But I think we also asked the question in the MOOC about where does responsibility lie when we think about things like environmental impacts of AI. There's the responsibility of the individual, but is there also a responsibility, for example, in institutions to really highlight and highlight about the environmental impacts, but think about, you know, what data centers do we use as an institution? And within the UK, where are we building lots and lots of data centers? Where are we building data centers? What is the consumption, energy consumption and water consumption of those data centers? And then, of course, I think on the companies themselves, there are some companies who are really trying to mitigate that fresh water consumption and the energy consumption. But there are some that are not under such huge scrutiny and so are not. So I think just trying to highlight all of those players is important, and it's really difficult and it's really challenging. And there's also just there's so much pressure on students, and staff to meet deadlines and to get things done quickly. I think it's really important to recognize that the kind of easy out is just to, you know, get a little bit of help from an AI tool. And it's because it's all unseen. It's again this like invisible nature of the implications of impacts of AI. Because it's unseen, it's easier to kind of blind yourself to it if it's more expedient for you to do so. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant and a ramble, but it's what I think.
Thank you. That was great. I've got another question, sort of slightly changing tack a little bit. So with your position now on the ethical use of AI, and Glasgow is in a bit of a flagship in being able to present your position on this, has there been any consideration around changing your assessment strategies, your learning and teaching assessment strategies, to perhaps enable students to not necessarily use AI for certain things, you know, essays, lab reports, things that we've all been discussing, how, you know, AI has been a big disruptor of how we change assessments. So has that had any impact on you as an institution in regards to your strategies?
Yes, I think definitely. And one of the other factors which influenced the development of this project and the symposium in the first place was back in 2023, when I came back from maternity leave. It really struck me that amongst my colleagues as well as students, there was huge amounts of fear around AI and what are we going to do, and how do we make assessment AI proof? And I think, like many institutions, Glasgow was kind of fairly reactive in our response to AI, because just kind of unexpected step change in the use of AI and its impact. But I actually really have been really pleased to see how much Glasgow has since engaged with the question of the kind of existential considerations we have to have as institutions around the impact of AI, and really what does it mean to be a higher education institution, and what is our purpose, and does our purpose change? Has our purpose changed? And are we, one, preparing students adequately for the environment that they will face when they leave university, and two, are we really assessing the right things, and how are we assessing those things? So Glasgow's developed so there's an AI working group at Glasgow. There's various discussion forums in Glasgow around AI and its implications for assessment and beyond. So I'm part of the College of Science and Engineering working group on AI and assessment, but then there's a broader AI working group at like senior management level. And we've had various iterations of guidance on AI in higher education. We started off with the kind of red light, amber light, green light guidance. We've just today actually publicly amongst within the university launched the most updated guidance, which is more of a kind of thou shalt not, or you can entirely use, you cut out the amber, because there was a lot of sense from students that it was really confusing, the guidance. And I think there still remains ambiguity. But what we are trying to do is really look at assessment and how we conduct assessment more broadly. So there's obvious implications of AI in, like you say, like lab reports, also in essay writing, in thesis writing.
Yeah.
So for research as well as teaching, clear implications. But in terms of assessment, there's been huge discussion. Do we move more towards face-to-face assessment? Do we incorporate more kind of Viva-like assessment? But then there's implications for workload and also inclusion. And do we move more away from in-person exams, or do we move more towards in-person exams to make AI proof? But that's probably a reductive approach. So I would say we're very much in discussion, and it is evolving all the time. But what I am pleased to see is that I think Glasgow is trying at least to be less reactive and more future thinking, and is not static in its approach. So it is open to developments. But I think it's a really, really difficult area to get right. And I'm not sure if there is a right or if there's lots of best options.
Yeah, it's a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's an absolute minefield, and it's fascinating and terrifying in equal measure, I think, of how disruptive it is. But myself and a colleague at Warwick are looking into researching and doing a project looking into actually whether exams are now actually more equitable than they ever used to be, because you can actually utilize different strategies, AI, to help you learn and consolidate your lecture material and your knowledge better than ever before. So could it be that we're looking at best practice and using it and the ethics around that a little bit. And so, yeah, it's just opened up so many questions, and we've moved, we've worked hard to move away from face-to-face in-person exams because they're not equitable.
Mm-hmm.
But actually now, do we look at these through a completely different lens? And so, yes, it's an absolute minefield. And I can see Roy chuckling away there. So I'm sure you're having the same challenges in your institution as well. But okay, thank you, Kirsty. So we've got 5 minutes left. Has anybody else got any other questions? If not, we can wrap up 5 minutes early. So that's brilliant. Okay, so thank you for attending for those that are external, and we'll be in touch with our next reminders of our next exciting webinars coming up in the next
Thanks
couple
so
of
much.
weeks.